Tony Abbott 4 years ago became opposition leader by a single vote by promising what Malcolm Turnbull wouldn't: to fight Labor plans for a price on carbon dioxide. Now, commentators said he was crazy, kamikaze. Former Labor pollster Rod Cameron said he was unelectable. But Abbott took that carbon tax and strangled Labor with it. He took Labor's deal with the Greens and buried Labor in shame. He'll now strip billions of dollars from useless green schemes. Labor grabbed that green cause then to show it at least stood for something. It followed the green dream, right over a cliff.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
The carbon tax has become just another vehicle for redistributing wealth. It's a form of socialism masquerading as environmentalism.
What would happen to the parties had to fight a double dissolution on this issue?
The party would be, look, we would be wiped out. This would be
You know, such political future as I have got rests entirely on beating this tax. Beating it in the Parliament if I can, but beating it in the electorate if I can't beat it in the Parliament. So that's the whole purpose of what's left of my political life, to do this.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. What we will do...
Now, I cannot promise victory. Obviously, this is going to be very tough, but I can promise a contest. It will be a good contest, it will be a clean contest, and I know my colleagues are gearing up for the fight of their life.
That has reformed the Australian economy and lifted the envy of the world.
To all of the people of Australia, that it has been a tremendous honour, opportunity and privilege to have served you.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
This is a devastating moment. I mean, let's not pretend that it's easy. I'm thinking about my staff, I'm thinking about my colleagues.
So what will happen? I mean, what will you do tomorrow? You obviously have to let staff go.
Oh yeah, I mean,
that's hard.
20 staff get sacked immediately tomorrow. My colleagues lose their seats. They have to pack up their offices. It's a devastating process. There's no joy in it, no joy in defeat.
You've been used to government for so long. How will you handle opposition?
I don't know. You've got to give it your best shot, haven't you?
Will you stay?
Well, you've got to give it your best shot, and I'm certainly saying 3 years. I'm not going anywhere. John Howard is a person that will accept responsibility. I mean, I say that without having heard anything he said. If we had won, he would have deserved all the credit. And if we lose, he accepts responsibility. That's the sort of person he is. We all have to accept some of it.
96 and held power for 11 years. That's an enormous record.
All right, let's have a listen to what he's going to say.
Thank you. Please. My fellow Australians, a few moments ago I telephoned Mr. Kevin Rudd and I congratulated him and the Australian Labor Party on a very emphatic victory. Now, this is a great democracy, and I want to wish Mr Rudd well. He assumes the mantle of the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, and I want to say there is no prouder job in the world than anybody can occupy than being the Prime Minister of this country. I wish him well in the task that he will undertake, and I want to say on behalf of the coalition that has governed this country for the last 11.5 years that we bequeath to him a nation that is stronger and prouder. I believe very profoundly that Australia's best years lie ahead of her, and I wish the government elected by the people today the very best of good fortune in the years ahead. Thank you.
And so the Howard years come to a close. Many coalition members face the role of opposition for the first time. And this will be without Peter Costello, who announced he will not contest the vacant Liberal leadership. This cast further uncertainty over the party and its members.
Surprised the party by turning down the leadership.
The time has come for me to open a new chapter in my life. I will be looking to build a career post-politics.
The Prime Minister-elect and his deputy flew into Canberra, keeping their new ministry lineup very much to themselves. Tomorrow, the party room will hear for the first time Kevin Rudd's choices.
Kevin's stamp in terms of the composition of the ministry, I think, will be accepted by the caucus.
Outgoing ministers were attending what one described as the Last Supper at the Lodge. Peter Costello and Alexander Downer didn't attend, and it's not clear if taxpayers footed the bill. The Liberals now looking to life after John Howard, and it seems they don't want a new leader as closely identified with him as Tony Abbott. He's pulling out of the race.
Having now done a very full canvass of my colleagues, it's pretty clear that they want to make, at least in some senses, a break with the Howard era.
Malcolm Turnbull is certainly promising that and seems to have the numbers.
The party room will make that decision tomorrow, OK?
But Brendan Nelson isn't giving up, happy with the support he's garnering. And for the first time, the Liberals may turn to a woman for the deputy's job.
If it's seen as an advantage, then that's an advantage I'm happy to take.
The Nationals are in disarray over their leadership. Barnaby Joyce and Peter McGorrin have pulled out, but late afternoon a somewhat reluctant Warren Truss has thrown his hat into the ring.
Whether or not climate change is real is no longer being debated. What to do about it is now the pressing issue.
This is the moral challenge of our generation.
It's easy to forget that this conference has already been running for 8 days, with bureaucrats discussing a number of possible drafts for the future.
This is one of the draft resolutions that's been circulating here. It calls for 25 to 40% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to below 1990 levels. It's bold, it's ambitious, and the world's worst emitters want no part of it. The United States and Japan are two countries that have already indicated their unwillingness to sign up for such deep cuts.
Australia was one of the countries involved in preparing that draft. Newly elected Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has changed his country's course on climate change. On Wednesday, he personally handed over the freshly ratified Kyoto Protocol to UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon.
This was the major difference between Labour and the coalition. Kevin Rudd had now committed Australia to major emission reduction, without reduction commitment from America, China or Japan.
New Liberal leader Malcolm Turnbull's promised to unite the party after winning this morning's snap leadership ballot by just 4 votes. His predecessor, Brendan Nelson, wiped away tears but vowed to stay in Parliament. Political reporter Alex Hart joins us now from Canberra. Alex, good afternoon. Can Mr Turnbull turn the coalition's fortunes around, do you think?
Sam, he's got a huge job ahead of him, not least of which is to convince nearly half of his team that he is in fact the right man for the job. Dr Nelson's shock decision to move a spill motion this morning did backfire, but only just. He lost 45 votes to 41. Julie Bishop retained the deputy's job unopposed, but there's no word yet on who will make up Mr Turnbull's shadow cabinet. Now, his daughter Daisy was there today, the only member of his family able to make it to Canberra at such short notice. She witnessed an emphatic acceptance speech. He promised a cohesive attack on the government. In a real pitch to the voters that deserted John Howard, he distanced himself from his own successful career. Clearly he's trying to shake that rich, arrogant tag that seems to exist in the public. Now, there is of course the loser's corner, and after wiping away tears with his wife Gillian, Dr Nelson promised his full support for Mr Turnbull, but only from the back bench. For now, he won't be accepting a shadow ministry. Let's hear from them both.
I do not come to the position of leader of the Liberal Party from a lifetime of privilege. I know what it's like to be very short of money. I know what it's like to live in rented flats.
As Parliament resumed, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd walked across to shake hands with his new opponent, and Dr Nelson, while promising full support for the man who beat him, turned down a spot in the new Turnbull shadow cabinet and went instead to the back benches.
Fran, it was always going to be difficult. The Australian people decided to elect a new government, essentially for 3 reasons: the longevity of John Howard and our previous government, the mistake, fundamental one we made with work choices in a bridge too far, and also the monstering around Kyoto and climate change. And having made the decision to elect a new government, Australians don't easily then start to think that maybe they got it wrong. And I think Mr Rudd, to his credit at least, has been particularly good at managing the impressions of the government and the messages from the government, and inevitably we've gone through a lot of the difficulties that oppositions do, having gone into opposition from being in government for a long period of time.
Realistically then, how long do you think it'll take before the coalition gets back into government?
Well, no one should underestimate Malcolm Turnbull, no one should underestimate the coalition. I've always been of the view, by the way, that Kevin Rudd is likely to go his full term.
Just on the emissions trading scheme, the whole notion helped sink your leadership. Yesterday you urged your colleagues not to act like intellectual lemmings on this issue. It sounds like a call to arms to reject the CPRS if it's brought back before Copenhagen. Is that clearly your view?
Well, look, Fran, it is.
Brendan Nelson, recently you told the Sydney Morning Herald that Malcolm Turnbull has a narcissistic personality disorder, which is a pretty serious claim. What brought you to that conclusion?
Oh, well, I'm not going to comment on any of that. Look.
Senior Liberal Tony Abbott has dismissed talk of a leadership challenge against Malcolm Turnbull. The opposition leader's copped a pounding in today's polls, taken after his disastrous attack on the Oscar fake email affair.
Brendan Nelson is a man who knows a bad poll when he sees one.
Do you have confidence
in your leader?
Well, of course. We always have confidence in the leader. Of course we do.
Of course. Polls like today's led to Dr Nelson being overthrown by Malcolm Turnbull. Despite that, the opposition leader is holding on.
It would be bizarre, weak-kneed and pathetic for the Liberal Party to, at the first sign of an ill wind, decide to change its leader.
The ill wind has blown in 3 disastrous polls for Malcolm Turnbull. As preferred Prime Minister, the news poll has Kevin Rudd close to his record highs. Mr Turnbull has plumbed new depths. Voter dissatisfaction with his performance is the worst for any leader in 25 years. A Galaxy poll shows only 7% of voters think Mr Turnbull was open and honest about the Utegate affair.
The coalition had a tough week in the Parliament last week, and when you've had a tough week you get bad polls. It's as simple as that.
Tony Abbott is only just edged out by Malcolm Turnbull in a poll on who's best to lead the Liberal Party. Peter Costello tops that contest.
There's no point in hankering after kings over the sea.
Malcolm Turnbull is tipped to use the 6-week winter recess to reshape his front bench. It's hoped older and wiser heads will give the Liberal leader's front bench some tactical oomph and maybe stop him making blunders like Utegate.
Well, he's less popular in the polls even than the coalition leader Malcolm Turnbull, but that hasn't stopped Tony Abbott from putting his thoughts together on the way forward for the Liberal Party. These thoughts are contained in a new book. It's called Battle Lines. It's being promoted as the essential manifesto for the thinking Liberal. Tony Abbott is the opposition spokesperson for Families, Housing and Community Services. He joins us this morning in our breakfast studio. Tony Abbott, welcome to breakfast.
Nice to be with you, Fran.
Now, Tony Abbott, let's be honest about it. Normally when a book like this is written, it's seen as a blueprint for a leadership challenge. Is this the blueprint for an Abbott-led Liberal Party?
No, it's not, but it is a contribution to debate. We're not going to win the next election just by criticising the Rudd government. We're not going to win the next election just by announcing policies a couple of weeks before polling day. If we're going to succeed, we need to have a thoroughgoing debate about what's wrong with our country and what can be done to fix our problems. And this is my take on some solutions that I think will reflect mainstream values and be consistent with liberal conservative thinking.
But I noticed on the 7:30 report last night, when you were asked about leadership, you said, my time is not now, this is Malcolm's time. How much time does Malcolm Turnbull have? He's hit new lows today of 16% as preferred Prime Minister.
Well, Malcolm was our choice. I think he was the right choice. And Malcolm will lead us to the next election. And my job, all of our jobs, is to help Malcolm and our party to be as competitive as possible at the next election.
Meanwhile, the Rudd government attempted to get the emissions trading scheme through Parliament. Rudd felt he had a win-win. Either Turnbull would support his emissions trading scheme in time for the Copenhagen UN conference in February 2010, or the issue would split the coalition.
In around 20 days, the Senate will vote on Australia's carbon pollution reduction scheme. 20 days until the most important vote on our national strategy to tackle climate change. 20 days from the vote on the government's cap-and-trade emissions trading system, which both sides of politics have recognised as the lowest cost way of tackling climate change in the Australian economy. And abroad, we are just 31 days away from Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Conference of Parties, an historic moment to forge a global deal to put a global price on carbon.
The government is going to take a very careful look at the cost of various amendments proposed.
They're also seeking a commitment from the coalition to vote on the legislation by the end of the year. Climate change debates have been linked to today's news poll, with support for the coalition at its lowest in over a year. Labor leads 59% to 41% on a two-party preferred basis.
The former US ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, has written an article accusing Kevin Rudd of being more interested in regulating the economy than reducing carbon emissions. John Bolton joins us now from Washington. Mr. Bolton, good morning.
Good morning, glad to be here.
Now, you're suggesting that Kevin Rudd is not the climate change saviour he presents himself to the Australian people and in Copenhagen to the international community.
Well, I think it's typical not just of the Prime Minister but of a number of other advocates of the kinds of solutions being discussed at Copenhagen, that these solutions, greater government control of the economy, greater government regulation, greater government interference in all of our daily lives, has been something that many of these people have believed in for years, for decades, even before global warming was much of an issue. And I think the real point is that whatever your view of the extent and causes and effects of global warming, the kinds of solutions being discussed at Copenhagen, I think, are both unrealistic and unlikely to produce the results intended.
What's unrealistic about an emissions trading scheme like the one proposed by the Australian government?
Well, number one, certainly Australia is free to put into effect any limitation it wants on carbon emissions. The question is whether Australia acting alone is going to make the slightest bit of difference worldwide. And I think we can see from the discussions in and leading up to Copenhagen that countries like India and China and others in the developing world are not going to put any effective limit on their carbon emissions and thereby limit their economic growth. I think it's questionable, in fact, whether many countries of the developed world, despite their rhetoric, are really going to be prepared to crunch their economies, particularly beginning in the middle of this recession.
So from that I take it you're not particularly optimistic of anything tangible, anything realistic coming out of the Copenhagen talks?
No, I think there'll be a lot of rhetoric, and that goes to my basic point. If people are talking about solutions that are not going to happen and acting as if that's really going to do something about global warming, that is not a serious effort. And what it says to me is that there's another agenda in play, one that's philosophically attuned to increased government regulation, whether there's global warming, global cooling, or no change at all.
Patrick Moore is considered one of the foremost environmentalists of his generation. He is co-founder of Greenpeace.
The shift to climate being a major focal point came about for two very distinct reasons. The first reason was because by the mid-'80s, a majority of people now agreed with all of the reasonable things we in the environmental movement were saying they should do. Now, when a majority of people agree with you, it's pretty hard to remain confrontational with them. And so the only way to remain anti-establishment was to adopt ever more extreme positions. When I left Greenpeace, it was in the midst of them adopting a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. Like I said, you guys, this is one of the elements in the periodic table, you know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's in our jurisdiction to be banning a whole element.
Destroying the wall were soon done.
The other reason that environmental extremism emerged was because world communism failed, the wall came down, and a lot of peaceniks and political activists moved into the environmental movement, bringing their neo-Marxism with them, and learned to use green language in a very clever way to cloak agendas that actually have more to do with anti-capitalism and anti-globalization than they do anything with ecology or science.
We want action, no more fraud. We want action, no more fraud. We want action, no.
Their next campaign, the world. Senator Brown last night called for the formation of a global parliament.
One planet, one person, one vote, one value. We must, we can, we will.
Stop global warming! Stop global warming! Stop global warming! Stop global warming! Stop global warming!
The share prices of the energy utilities, the old coal-fired ones, haven't gone down. We'll only know that we're having an effect on greenhouse gases in Australia when we see a crash in the share prices of the coal-fired electricity generators.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
It is time to be totally blunt about the agenda of the climate change sceptics in all their colours, some more sophisticated than others. It is to destroy the carbon pollution reduction scheme at home, and it is to destroy agreed global action on climate change abroad. And our children's fate, our grandchildren's fate, will lie entirely with them. It is time to remove any polite veneer from this debate. The stakes are that high. The first category of those opposed to action is the vocal group of conservatives who do not accept the scientific consensus. This group believes the science is inconclusive and does not provide an evidentiary basis for anthropogenic climate change. In Australia, before the 2007 election, this group was thought to be relatively small. There appeared for a time to be bipartisan consensus on the need for action on climate change. In recent times, this bipartisan support has frayed. Would-be Liberal leader Tony Abbott said in July this year that, and I quote him, "The science is contentious to say the least," unquote.
This conference started with a hacked email scandal calling into question the very science of climate change. Today, another scandal is hanging over it. I mean, this one involving a leaked memo. What is going on?
This email says we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it is a travesty that we can't. That implies that the evidence for global warming is rather weak, or that some evidence is being suppressed.
External investigators will check papers published by the unit after accusations that they distorted evidence about global warming.
After 1,000 hours or more of research, a computer programmer and a certified consulting meteorologist found that temperature data has been manipulated at U.S. government climate centers.
Well, I'm one of the scholars who does fundamental research that the IPCC cites in its reports. So it was with some surprise I saw in its most recent report that it had a graph showing a relationship between increasing temperatures and the increasing cost of damages. That's surprising because there's no evidence in the literature to suggest that relationship.
The suggestion of the scientists in the ClimateGate emails was that you hide the decline using Mike's nature trick, which I think is some sort of fudge.
I was horrified to read the second and the third assessment reports because there was so much misinformation without any kind of recourse, or virtually without mention of the scientific literature, the truly scientific literature, the literature by specialists in those fields.
With it, so in fact the world started warming back after the Little Ice Age about 250 years ago, and the climate change panel of the United Nations is saying since 1950 we have been the main cause of warming of the Earth. Yet during the first half of the 20th century there was a warming period about identical to the warming period that occurred in the last half, and they're not claiming that we caused that. They're not really saying what they think caused that. So there is simply no logic to saying that we know for certain. That's why they use the term likely. Actually, they say extremely likely, which is no really different than saying likely. It's just their opinion. In other words, it is a judgment that humans are causing the warming rather than any kind of scientific proof.
Net Daily reports that more than 31,000 U.S. scientists, including 9,000 PhDs, now signed a petition rejecting global warming, the assumption that human production of greenhouse gases is damaging Earth's climate. My question, what is the White House reaction to these 31,000 U.S. scientists?
Say that everyone's entitled to their opinion.
The key thing for us is to not to pay any attention to those things, because as I said, the science is in, we know the facts, there's not any more debate, there's still global warming.
The statement that the science is settled, I think originated not with Al Gore, but with Senator Tim Wirth, somewhere around 1995-96. It has been used frequently, and it's used to stop any debate.
The debate's over. The science is agreed upon. The debate is over, and the science is in.
It's absurd for people to say that sort of thing. It's really wrong.
We followed the evidence. There are quite literally hundreds of factors that influence global temperature, everything from tilt to the Earth's axis, to ocean cycles, to water vapor, methane, solar system, the sun, cloud feedback, volcanic dust. The idea that CO2 is the tail that wags the dogs is not supportable. And if you go down and look at the scientific literature, we're finding reams of data in new peer-reviewed studies showing the medieval and Roman warming periods as warm or warmer than today without our CO2 emissions. So what's happened here is the whole movement, because now we've gone 16 years without global warming, according to the UN data, and they've now morphed into extreme weather. And we have the absurd spectacle of people claiming that acts of Congress and the United Nations can control the weather and make hurricanes less nasty and make tornadoes less frequent, which, by the way, none of them are showing any trends at all that are unusual.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and treaties such as the Kyoto Protocol are primarily based on climate model forecasts of what's going to happen in the future. Our issue associated with that then is if the climate models are somehow biased or incomplete, then our forecast of what the future might look like is too biased and incomplete. The science in this case is indicating from incomplete models that we need to make political assertions and political changes. But part of the problem is that with incomplete science, we can make mistakes in policy that can have serious ramifications in the future.
If you keep giving these scientists millions of dollars a year to tell you you have a problem and you need to fix it, and please give me more money so I can keep studying this problem, they will keep telling you that it's a problem. This is a self-perpetuating, massive convergence of interests, not a conspiracy, but a convergence of interests among elites in society, including the media, politicians, environmentalists, scientists, and business who wants to look green. And it's killing us because there is nothing wrong with the Earth's climate. What is wrong is the climate of the intellect. It is an intellectual climate problem, not a science climate problem, not an Earth climate problem.
If this legislation is knocked back, Kevin Rudd will have no choice but to go to a double dissolution election. This is a fundamental plank.
What would happen to the party if had to fight a double dissolution on this issue?
The party would be, look, we would be wiped out. This would be the idea that we would go, I mean, you've got to ask yourself, have we learnt nothing from 2007?
Now, as leader, I am not frightened of an election. And I am not frightened of an election on this issue. I really am not frightened of an election on this issue because as far as many, many millions of Australians are concerned, what the Rudd government ETS looks like is a great big tax to create a great big slush fund to provide politicised handouts run by a giant bureaucracy.
Without carbon dioxide,
insect-borne diseases such as malaria will explode. Where it's dry, it's likely to become much drier.
It has the potential to escalate into the largest global catastrophe mankind has ever known.
Just remember this. The first legislation to establish an emissions trading scheme was introduced into the House of Representatives by me as John Howard's Environment Minister. It was our policy. We were committed to an emissions trading scheme.
The emissions bill will be debated in 23 days. The Coalition had determined to vote it down, but yesterday Malcolm Turnbull appeared to some to open the door on amending the bill and then passing it.
There's an overwhelming consensus that that the law should be changed, and we should seek to advance and promote those changes.
Barnaby Joyce is at it again.
On every issue in the Senate, you reserve your right to vote differently.
This time round, he's threatening to go his own way on emissions trading, warning the government's proposal will cost jobs.
There's a desire out there by some parties that we should blindly follow this sort of eco-fanaticism.
But once again, that's put the Nationals at odds with their coalition partners.
We're very committed to action on climate change that is economically responsible.
Malcolm Turnbull ended last year fending off claims of coalition rebellion. Today he tried to nip in the bud fresh speculation about party disunity.
We work as a very close coalition, and I've no doubt that we will be responding to this legislation with one voice.
The government's pounced on the hint of a split.
Malcolm Turnbull is willing to tolerate climate change sceptics, is willing to tolerate a front bench that doesn't seem to be able to agree on anything, is willing to tolerate a coalition partner that only votes with him when it feels like it.
To other news now, and Malcolm Turnbull has dramatically upped the ante over the emissions trading scheme, effectively putting his leadership on the line. In the latest salvo to head off a growing Liberal rebellion, Mr Turnbull said he couldn't be in charge of a party that didn't believe in change. But his words appear to have fallen on deaf ears. Some Liberal backbenchers have told the ABC their leader is, quote, a dictator with no political nous. Chief Political Correspondent Mark Simpkin.
The opposition leader discussed employment opportunities with a group of students.
He referred to the concept of lifetime employability,
But Malcolm Turnbull's the one with a job on the line, and he put it there.
If the party room were to reject my recommendations to them, that would obviously be a leadership issue. That's perfectly plain, quite clear. And I'm asserting my leadership and my authority as the leader of the party.
He delivered a blunt message to his troops. When it comes to an emissions trading scheme, back me or sack me.
I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am.
Malcolm Turnbull says he's confident he will win the support of the joint party room. Shadow cabinet's on side, but the ABC's been told as much as 80% of the backbench is not.
I have the deepest respect for Malcolm, and I deeply believe that he believes that he's doing the right thing, but on this issue, the National Party has not been convinced that Mr Rudd, godlike, can change the climate.
The Nationals will almost certainly vote against the scheme, but Malcolm Turnbull's bigger challenge is his own party. At least one Liberal says he'd rather lose a leader than get an ETS.
If a leader feels obliged to put their job on the line to support that sort of concept, well, I won't be voting for it on those grounds, and I think many others will be offended that threat's been made.
Other Liberals say they're gobsmacked by Malcolm Turnbull's ultimatum. One called it a brain snap by a man with no political nous. Another said the dictator's palace is paranoid. The backbenchers estimate that 7 Liberals will ultimately cross the floor on the ETS. As one said, a number big enough to bring down a leader, assuming the leader doesn't bring down himself.
Joe Hockey has said on radio today, reluctantly confirming that the party has approached him to take over the opposition leadership over Malcolm Turnbull. Now, he didn't say a lot on radio, but what he did say spoke volumes.
People talk to me about all sorts of things. Well, I'm not going to lie and pretend something hasn't happened.
Joe Hockey is often described as having leadership qualities, but whether he has the ambition to take the job soon is not so clear. Some say Malcolm Turnbull is only himself to blame for these rumblings because he put his leadership on the line when demanding the Liberal Party negotiate with Labor on its climate change emissions trading scheme. But his leadership was the last thing he wanted to talk about today.
The only leadership I'm focused on is the lack of leadership from Kevin Rudd.
And Alicia, Malcolm Turnbull has called a special party room meeting on October 18 to try to sort out his party's position on climate change once and for all. A tough ask.
Our ability to be a credible political party depends on securing the support of the majority of Australians. The vast majority of Australians.
But that includes your base as well.
The vast majority of Australians want to see action on climate change. If this legislation is knocked back, Kevin Rudd will have no choice but to go to a double dissolution election. This is a fundamental plank.
What would happen to the party if had to fight a double dissolution on this issue?
The party would be, look, we would be wiped out. This would be the idea that we would go. I mean, you've got to ask yourself, have we learnt nothing from 2007?
Malcolm Turnbull will know tomorrow if his climate change compromise strategy will work. Either way, it'll be a bruising affair for the opposition leader as he stares down a group of sceptics and tries to finalise a deal with the government. There are also mutterings of a move against his leadership from his hardline critics. From Canberra, here's Chief Political Correspondent Mark Simkin.
Environmentalists held a literal doorstop. They blockaded the entrance to Parliament House and demanded deeper cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. The sceptical senator tried to turn the tide.
There is something else also driving climate change other than just carbon dioxide emissions.
The police arrested scores of people. Inside the building, the opposition leader was doing some heavy lifting of his own, trying to drag a divided coalition towards an ETS compromise.
This is not about global climate change, it's about global taxation and global control, and that's why we will never support it.
This bill is worse than bad. It's worse than bad.
The Climate Change Minister put the final touches to the deal she'll offer the opposition tomorrow morning. It'll contain some sweeteners for polluters, but won't give the coalition everything it wants.
I appeal to all those on opposition benches who are people of goodwill to look beyond our normal partisan divide and to join with the government and seeing the passage of this carbon pollution reduction scheme for the future.
The government's offering to extend the parliamentary sitting to the weekend if necessary.
Mr Speaker, the deal that we put to the opposition is a deal for this week.
Even Malcolm Turnbull's supporters are predicting a bloody brawl at tomorrow's joint party room meeting. There's talk of a secret ballot and even a leadership spill.
A great success for common sense and for the environment.
But it's not a good system if more people speak against it and he makes a unilateral decision.
Well, isn't it a wonderful thing we live in a democracy where people have the capacity to do that?
It's not a democracy though.
Well, the Labor Party is not a democracy at all. And we can talk about dissent and the debate in the Liberal Party and the National Party because we actually have it. In the Labor Party you have this, if we go forward with this tax, we've endorsed a proposition that Kevin Rudd, omnipotent-like, can change the temperature of the globe by himself. I find that rather amazing.
You've got Malcolm Turnbull in league with him now.
Well, that's a question for them. The National Party has a different position. We don't believe that Kevin Rudd is a god. We don't believe that he can unilaterally change the temperature of the globe. We don't believe this is anything more than a massive new tax that is just going to give people two options in their life. They're either going to be poorer or broke.
Life and times, politicians are behind the whole.
The opposition leaders' confidants expect to get a reasonable deal from the government, and if they do, they'll recommend the coalition support it. They've done the internal numbers and are confident, although they concede some Liberals and the Nationals will defy Malcolm Turnbull in the Senate. As one frontbencher put it, it's going to hurt, but Malcolm's confident he can handle the pain.
Is there a candidate who's prepared to go away and prepare?
Well, I understand that Kevin Andrews has indicated publicly that he would be a candidate. I have not canvassed others. Kevin advised me more in sorrow than anger that the way the trend was going in the party room on Malcolm's rules, that he would judge at the end of the debate who was for and who was against. Those of us who carefully recorded the numbers had a consistent outcome that more people spoke against it than spoke for it, and on Malcolm's rules he should have responded accordingly. But furthermore, had he been John Howard, halfway through the debate he would have read the mood of the party room and said, well, oops, hello fellas, we better stop this. This is highly disruptive, this is not going as it should. We better start having meetings and try and find some middle ground. Middle ground was proposed to Malcolm Turnbull by a senior shadow cabinet minister, which was to just delay things, don't make a decision, don't go and sell out to Kevin Rudd. The reality is that I believe in the circumstances the leadership has come into play, because the leader has virtually told the party room they don't count, they don't matter. He, as he said repeatedly last night, I'm the leader, I'm the leader, I'm the leader. And of course he's been sold that message by Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan constantly attacking him in the Parliament, saying, show some leadership, Malcolm, show some leadership.
Now I know, and I just repeat this is a difficult issue for many Liberals, many Australians. But I repeat, most people who doubt the science also know that it makes sense to take out insurance, to manage the risk, to give the planet the benefit of the doubt. Now at the moment, as you know, some of my colleagues have found it necessary to resign from ministerial positions so they can cross the floor on the issue. That's their right and I respect it. But I believe we must maintain this course of action.
Malcolm Turnbull's demeanour in his press conference was very forceful and authoritative, particularly for somebody who's presiding over a party meltdown. Dennis Shanahan, did you expect Malcolm Turnbull to come out so defiantly?
No, and with Malcolm Turnbull it's often the
the least predictable thing that he actually does. He gave a very good performance, but it was designed to put the last-ditch argument on an ETS and to ensure that his critics, if they do succeed, will be left with a very difficult legacy to get around.
His strategy is obviously to fight. Is there any prospect that that could actually work for him, Peter Hartcher?
Well, it's not enough, even presuming that the Turnbull forces can, in their new league with the Rudd government, get the ETS through the Parliament. That's not going to be enough to save Malcolm Turnbull's leadership. Malcolm Turnbull has been in the killing zone for political leaders ever since the Godwin-Gretsch affair. The only reason he hasn't been challenged and replaced already is that the party has lacked one essential precondition for a change, and that's a candidate. Well, today we got the candidate. His name is Tony Abbott.
The end game is to change the policy. Now, it looks like that means changing the leader. I regret that, but if that's what it takes, that's what I want to try to do. Yeah, what I've said all along is that what we need to do is change the policy, and then we need to heal the party. And if Joe is the person who is best placed to heal the party, well, that's fine by me.
If you listen to the language that Malcolm Turnbull used in that press conference about needing to take action, protecting the planet for our children and our grandchildren, it almost sounded like something that you'd hear Kevin Rudd say. Do you think that that's likely to have played well at all to his party room?
Well, I know that it actually upset quite a few members of his party room.
I think Joe Hockey, as the sort of heir apparent, the go-to candidate, was hoping to sit and wait to allow Malcolm Turnbull to settle this particular dispute, to allow the party to enter the new year, and then, at a time of his own choosing and on his own terms, to think about taking the leadership. But I suspect he's now... we haven't seen much of him because he's living in fear that he's going to have to get involved in this fight. He doesn't want it. Why would you? The coalition's share of the vote is at rock bottom. The party's a mess. He would inherit this dreadful fight over the ETS against one of the most popular Prime Ministers we've seen in a generation.
Just after question time today, Senator Nick Minchin and I went to see Malcolm Turnbull. We put it to Malcolm that in the light of the heavy criticism from industry groups of the amendments that we had proposed with the government, and in the light of the meltdown which is currently taking place within the Liberal Party, that the matter should be reconsidered. Nick and I put it to Malcolm that given the adverse reaction to the deal done with the government, we should instead accept the amendments and propose that the amended bill be sent to a Senate inquiry for reporting and ultimate voting in February after the Copenhagen conference, because it was important that we should run on the nation's timetable. It was important that we should do things according to the national interest rather than just to give the Prime Minister a personal victory to take to Copenhagen. Malcolm was unprepared to reconsider. It was, I have to say, a very civil, rational, courteous conversation conducted in a spirit of mutual respect. But I indicated to Malcolm at the end of the conversation that given his position, I could no longer support the opposition's policy and therefore could no longer be in the shadow cabinet. I hasten to add that this is a very difficult decision for me. I've always regarded myself as a loyal party man. I've always been someone who instinctively supports the leader, regardless of whether the leader is of any particular opinion or persuasion on issues. I think over the last 6 months in particular, I've been very active in supporting the leader. sometimes in difficult circumstances. So this isn't a leadership issue at all. It's a policy issue, although obviously I would much have preferred the leadership to have taken us in a different direction on this issue.
Would you stand if the leadership became vacant?
Well, just at the moment, I am feeling a bit... I mean, this has been a pretty heavy week, as you can imagine, and for someone who has, I think, the record of loyalty to the party and to the leader that I've had, this has been an incredibly momentous decision, and as I said, all I'm thinking about at the moment is the policy, and the important thing is to get the policy right.
Can you answer the question? Can you answer the question?
Well, look, I don't know what might happen in the next few days.
Good evening, Jeremy Fernandez with ABC News. Joe Hockey is tonight on the brink of stepping forward to take the opposition leadership. The Shadow Treasurer is set to bow to demands that he stand as a unifying figure between the warring factions tearing the Liberal Party apart. Mr Hockey has held talks in Sydney with his likely running mate Peter Dutton, but Malcolm Turnbull is refusing to go quietly. He's up the ante, savaging those who oppose him. From Canberra, here's political correspondent Greg Jennett.
Here's the true blue Manly Liberal and his plotting.
You normally go around the orange boy, around the yellow boy and come in.
With some help from his friends. Tony Abbott is the challenger Malcolm Turnbull can see. Joe Hockey is the one he should fear.
I've got nothing to say.
Pressure for him to stand as a unifying figure is immense. He's gone so far as seeking John Howard's counsel.
How are the numbers?
Watch out for that gentleman there.
The arrival of a likely running mate in Peter Dutton for talks at Mr Hockey's house
Does Turnbull know you're here?
is evidence that he's preparing to make his move regardless of his leader's jawboning.
Joe Hockey has told me as recently as last night that I have his complete support. Joe is absolutely at one with me.
A Hockey leadership would come with an emissions trading backdown, a decision to defer a vote on the bill until next year, and in Malcolm Turnbull's eyes, that would make him a Minchinite.
If Joe were to become leader, he was the cuddly, friendly face of the Liberal Party, but spouting Nick Minchin's lines, that would destroy him and destroy the party.
He holds his Senate leader beneath contempt and dedicated an extraordinary 16-minute interview to underline his point that they're wrecking the party.
He is on a course of action that is calculated to destroy our party.
I've given 30 years of my life to working full-time for this great party. The party is much greater than me or Mr Turnbull or anybody else.
Whatever misgivings Joe Hockey has, and despite his inclinations to loyalty, his emergence appears unstoppable. He is, in the words of one source, the only man who can stop the gunfighters killing themselves and the party. And when he does, Malcolm Turnbull's support base will collapse beneath him. All that remains to be seen is when he realises that. The only declared challenger would back out instantly.
If the senior statesmen of our party think that Joe would be best placed to heal the wounds, I'm very happy with that, very happy.
Thus saving one political life as another goes under.
We'll see.
Did Mr Hockey tell you this morning that he intends to challenge you tomorrow?
Look, you can ask Mr Hockey about his intentions. I can only tell you about my intention. I will be standing tomorrow. I am the leader and I'll be standing tomorrow.
Is it any clearer to you who will be standing tomorrow, whether Joe Hockey will be standing?
Obviously, I'm bringing on a spill, and in the absence of anyone else, I certainly will be a candidate.
You know, above all else, it's time for a new leader. I mean, if anybody is still contemplating, that's in our party, voting for Malcolm Turnbull, they've got an example over the weekend that if he were re-elected, too bad if you've got a differing point of view with him at some time in the future on some other subject, you're going to have your reputation shredded through the media. You know, this is a Liberal leader bucketing Liberals.
One thing I can say for certain is that Malcolm does not have my support. I mean, 2 months ago, unfortunately, Malcolm Turnbull brought this issue into the leadership realm and into the public realm with his statements about the Liberal Party leadership and climate change. The simple reality is this should have been behind closed doors. This shouldn't have been a leadership issue. Look, I think that Malcolm is in scorched earth policy right at the moment. If he's not going to get the leadership, he will do as much damage on the way out as he can. I was warned about this by some members who knew him, and unfortunately it's transpiring. I mean, the way he was attacking members of the Liberal Party was quite extraordinary. I've never seen other leaders, albeit leaders in trouble, that have done the same thing.
So is there regrets within the party for getting rid of Brendan Nelson?
Well, I mean, I'll be quite frank. I was one of those that voted for Malcolm, and I'll be quite frank in saying that I made a mistake.
In discussions with Joe, and I've got to say that I very much respect Joe. I like Joe. He's been a mate of mine for a long time. But it now seems pretty clear that we could change the leader to Joe, and these offensive bills could still go through the Parliament. So I don't find that acceptable. I think that it's important that our party oppose these bills. That's what I wanted Malcolm to do. That's the chance that Malcolm and I, that Nick and I gave Malcolm last Thursday. So given Joe's reluctance, should he be elected leader, to ask the party to vote against these bills in the Parliament this week, should it come to that, I will be a candidate for the leadership tomorrow, regardless of anyone else who might be a candidate, should the spill motion be carried. My position is that it is the duty of the opposition to oppose, and that we owe it to Liberal voters, we owe it to the country at large to subject this bit of legislation to the most rigorous scrutiny, given that this is for keeps, this legislation. It's $120 billion, and that's just for starters. And I think it would be a very sad Parliament, and certainly a very misguided opposition, which simply waved this thing through so that Kevin Rudd can take a trophy to Copenhagen. Now, I'm quite happy to see the Australian Prime Minister look good on the world stage, but not if it jeopardises our national interest, not if it puts our exporters at a competitive disadvantage, perhaps forever. I mean, let's face it, we cannot save this. Australia cannot save the world on its own. And the idea that Australia should have an emissions trading system ahead of the rest of the world, it will damage us economically, and it won't do anything for the environment. That's why I think it's very important that we should oppose these bills in the Parliament this week if we can't get them referred to.
And how do you...
For Abbott, it was the biggest step of his career. And so the first ballot was taken. The first round saw Abbott with 35 votes, Turnbull 26 and Hockey 23. Hockey was therefore eliminated and a second round vote was taken. This was won by Abbott, 42, Turnbull, 41. Tony Abbott won the leadership by a single vote. That single vote would lead to the fall of two prime ministers and the ascendancy of another.